A U.S. Senate debate showdown.
We have schools shut down that scientists say you may be able to open.
We need to make sure that all North Carolinians have quality and affordable health care.
The candidates on the attack.
There's a fine balance that you have to strike when you're an elected leader.
Instead, we have seen a colossal failure of leadership in Washington.
Heading towards an election too close to call. Tonight, live from Raleigh, our political analysts are tallying their debate scorecards. From your local election headquarters, this is Post Debate Live.
In one of the most closely watched Senate races in the country, Republican incumbent Thom Tillis and Democratic challenger Cunningham face off for the very first time. Thanks for joining us for Post Debate Live. I'm Marius Payton.
I'm Angela Taylor. Tonight we're breaking down all the big moments from this evening's debate and how it could impact November's election and which party ends up controlling the Senate.
That could all come down to this one race. CBS 17's Russ Bowen is taking a look at what could be possible game changers for both candidates.
That's right. Angela Morris, thank you for that. To help us do that, we have April Dawson, an associate dean and law professor at North Carolina Central University. April specializes in constitutional law and voting rights. She also hosts a weekly radio show and podcast. And we've also got Mitch Kokai, who is a former government reporter for both radio and television and now serves as a senior political analyst for the John Locke Foundation and the Carolina Journal. Guys, thank you both so much for spending some time with us tonight. We've all commented on the fact that they spent more than 30 minutes talking about the coronavirus within this 1 hour debate. So let's start off with that. We have some sound of them talking about the fact that there has been no movement, basically, for this second round of stimulus from the federal government regarding coronavirus. Let's take a listen and we'll talk about it on the other side.
We have schools shut down that scientists say you may be able to open safely and to give it a chance, as many schools in North Carolina have done, not many public schools. There's a fine balance that you have to strike when you're an elected leader. I had people calling on me to criticize Governor Cooper and his response, and I said, this is a fluid situation. The briefing we got in January was different from the briefing that we got in February. And after the briefing in February is when Nancy Pelosi and de Blasio up in New York were saying we're open for business. Now, we know you can always do more. You know, David, you've covered hurricanes several times in your career here. You can always think about things you should have done differently, some places that should have been evacuated, other ones that didn't need to. But we're in the midst of a crisis still. And that bill that I voted on last week had additional resources for vaccine research. He said he would vote against it. That bill would actually provide certainty to people who desperately need unemployment that's about to run out in a couple of weeks. We have to actually manage a crisis, and I believe that Cal will look back as the no vote that he would have cast last week as a mistake.
One of the issues that I have with the vote that Senator Tillis was just talking about is we're in the middle of a public health crisis, and yet we now have more people without access to quality and affordable health care than we did before the start of this crisis. We're more vulnerable to this crisis because of the policies we had been pursuing as a nation before. We need to close those coverage gaps. We need to expand Medicaid, for instance. We need to make sure that all North Carolinians have quality and affordable health care. I've also been calling for the need to make sure people can preserve their homes, pay the rent checks. I, too, have been calling for substantial unemployment assistance, more than Senator Tillis, I think, has been proposing, in order to put money in the hands of families who need it the most at this time. It requires a whole-of-government response. Deployment of things like the Defense Production Act, which could have been used from early days, all the way through now, to make sure we have a strong national response. Instead, we have seen a colossal failure of leadership in Washington.
And so, Mitch, I'm going to start with you on this. Tillis did go on the attack in terms of Cunningham saying last week that he would not have voted for that Senate version of this particular bill. Of course, the House side of Congress passed their version several months ago. Was Cunningham, in your opinion, effective in defending that? We certainly know that Democrats have said it doesn't go far enough.
Yeah, he certainly made that point, and I think this is one of those issues where the people who are really going to be the decision makers in this race are not going to come down one way or the other on this. Tillis has his vote he can point to where he said, hey, I voted for more relief. Cunningham says he wouldn't. Cunningham comes back and says, look, This bill just doesn't go far enough. I think you're going to get lost in sort of the political inside baseball for people like us who really pay a lot of attention to it. The decision makers, who are the people in the middle, the people who might be swayed one way or the other, they're going to look at it and say, I don't really know. One guy said one thing, the other guy said another thing. They didn't really convince me one way or the other that they're the best person.
April?
Well, you know, one of the things that struck me about Tillis's response was that he used it as an opportunity to frame how it is that he was going to characterize Cal Cunningham. So he mentioned Nancy Pelosi, he mentioned Chuck Schumer, and I also thought that Cal Cunningham did a good job in responding by talking about leadership and then talking about his military service. And those are points that Cunningham is going to emphasize over and over again to demonstrate the difference between the two of them. So I think in their discussion about the COVID response and the president's response, I think you could see very clearly where it was that they were going to take their responses in this debate.
They were both asked if they would take a vaccine for COVID-19 if and when it does become available. We had very different answers, so let's take a listen to what they said there.
The FDA is not going to allow a vaccine to go to market if for no other reason than you'd have trial lawyers like Cal possibly suing them for doing it. I have no doubt in my mind that the vaccine would be safe. I would gladly do it, but you know who I want to have a vaccine before me? My daughter, who's a nurse. She just had my second grandchild. People in congregate care facilities that can't get visits from home. I talked to a gentleman in a farmer's market on Saturday. He's got a wife with Alzheimer's. He's not allowed to see her. You bet I'll get a vaccine, like I got the flu vaccine last week, and I encourage everybody else to do the same. But only until I know that the most vulnerable population, anyone over the age of 65, people with underlying health conditions, frontline workers, law enforcement, the people who should get it first. And I think we place a priority on that, and as soon as I know that they've been protected, then I'll be standing in line.
I've got questions, and I think we have seen entirely too many times, and especially in recent years, politics intervening in what should be driven by health and science. Whether it's CDC, Center for Disease Control, suggestions and recommendations on how we deal with this pandemic, we've seen politics intervene there. Historically and traditionally, I would support and have confidence in the Food and Drug Administration and the processes that they go through in order to approve a drug. But we have seen an extraordinary corruption in Washington. We have seen political and financial corruption that has intervened in and diluted and distorted decision-making in Washington, D.C. So as the senator for North Carolina, I would have a lot of questions of the FDA. I think the American people have questions about the government of this country, the governance of this country right now. The senator for North Carolina would be asking questions not only about this vaccine, but also about the underlying political and financial influences that are leading to distorted decision-making in Washington.
So, April, there are two things that stick out here as far as I'm concerned. You've got Tillis saying that the FDA is the gold standard, and then you've got Cunningham saying that too many politics involved in all the decision-making since day one when it comes to coronavirus. How much of this is about trust? There are a lot of folks out there who are questioning decisions that have been made. Some are not questioning, but how smart was Cunningham to put this little nugget in there?
I thought he was very effective in his response. So he was able to focus on, the point about trust, and we know that a number of independents who may be swayed, right, who haven't made up their mind which candidate they're going to vote for. And Cunningham repeated over and over again that even in normal situations, he might rely upon the FDA. He might not have any problems with them saying that a vaccine should be taken. But under the current circumstances, he talked about the corruption in Washington, D.C. He had this one line where he said, we need to look no further than Tillis himself. And I thought that was incredibly effective. And he mentioned 500,000 that Tillis was taking from Big Pharma. And Tillis did not have a response to that. So I thought Cunningham and the way he was able to pivot from that question to focus on corruption in D.C., tie that back to Tillis, was incredibly effective.
And Mitch, Tillis took another angle with this. He really decided to go down to the heartstrings of America, right? When it all comes down to it, during crisis, we get behind our first responders, we get behind our elderly and our elderly population. Why do you think he took this angle instead of, going a little bit more in depth with just, the process that comes with getting this vaccine?
I think Tom Tillis was trying to send the viewers a message that, look, we're going to have this vaccine, we're making this push, and once it's there, sure, I'm going to take it. But as you mentioned, he said he's going to have other people who need the vaccine take it first, including, he adds in his own daughter who's a nurse, so he gets that little piece of the personal history out there. But you saw a very stark difference in the answers. Tom Tillis said, yes, I'm going to take the vaccine, we should trust it. Cal Cunningham asks the questions, buys into the idea that people have about the Trump FDA and whether it's been tainted by politics. And then, as has already been mentioned, he then also gets to throw in his jab about Big Pharma supporting Tillis. So that was something that helped him score one of his political points. But I think it's going to be interesting to see if that has any impact on voters. The people who have been scared, who've been staying at home, do they say, hey, I support the guy who's going to take the vaccine, or I support the guy who has questions about the vaccine, or does this only end up playing to the bases?
One other issue that we've certainly seen a lot in the news lately are these folks who have, millions of people who have lost their jobs, not on furlough, lost their jobs, which means they've lost their health care. They both have a very different approach to this as well. Let's take a listen to what each candidate had to say about health care coverage in a crisis like this.
Not just reversing his position on a matter that he said was a matter of principle, but then North Carolina lost funding to our military installations and our military communities. Over $80 million lost because of his flip-flop and because he decided to back and kowtow to the political pressure. Those are just a couple of examples. We could go on about trade. We could go on about him changing his views on China.
Cal wants to talk about $80 million. I want to talk about $3 billion. That's the amount of money that I've fought for and secured for military installations in North Carolina over the last 5.5 years. I want to talk about 3 historic pay raises. Cal's got an ad that's been proven largely false, or one of his supporters, the $75 million that Chuck Schumer has spent in this race already, getting ready for that rubber stamp to put in your hands, Cal.
So, Mitch, Senator Tillis really did a pivot, if I've ever seen one here, to talk about what he's done for the military in our state. Of course, we have one of the largest military populations in the whole country. Was that smart on his part?
Well, yes. I mean, one of the things that has been a point of criticism for Tom Tillis throughout the campaign, and especially was so during the Republican primary, was flip-flopping on this issue of supporting Donald Trump and emergency powers for the border wall. He wrote the op-ed. Then, right after writing the op-ed, he ends up voting the other way. That was something that hurt him a bit with the Republican base, and now it's something that Cal Cunningham is bringing back into the discussion and saying that because of that decision to end up voting for the emergency powers for the president, that ended up costing money for the military bases. And Tom Tillis says, wait a minute, you aren't mentioning the fact that I brought in $3 billion. It's wise of him not to talk about the flip-flop. Having followed that issue very closely, what Tom Tillis wrote about in the op-ed was standing up for the principle of Congress having the major role in deciding policy, but that's not what people were hearing. People were hearing, are you for or against the president? Once he realized that, I think that was what cast his fate on that one. But certainly, avoiding discussion of his flip-flop is something he's going to have to do.
April, and that's a craft, isn't it? The ability to do that.
It is, but in some ways I was surprised that Tillis took the approach of Cal Cunningham will say anything to be elected. He'll say something and then he'll do something else, because I think that just played into Cal Cunningham being able to bring up this flip-flop. He actually brought it up later in the debate than I thought he would, but it may have been that they spent so much time talking about COVID initially. And this came up when he was talking about him shifting his position, and the moderator said, well, do you have any examples? And he was able to list a couple of things, and that New York Times op-ed was one of the things that he noted, and he was able to bring out that line, which was the Olympic gold medal flip-flop, right? And so I was just kind of surprised that, he Tillis was saying kind of throughout the debate, he will say anything to get elected, but he'll do something else. So, you know, I think it is, you do have to be able to pivot, but you also have to be very careful about the way in which you characterize your opponent so that it doesn't come back to bite you.
I want to ask you a general question just about the debate itself. Do you think it was helpful or harmful or no opinion in that there were no time limits on these answers? Mitch?
Well, in terms of getting out information on a bunch of different issues, it certainly hurt because spending more than a half hour on COVID-19, that then limited the amount of time to get to other issues. It did, though, give you, I think, a better sense than some debates do. Certainly those presidential debates that we saw where you'd have 12 candidates and they all get to chime in for 20 or 30 seconds. It certainly was more helpful about getting a sense of who the candidates were. I think Tillis came out right away. He was on the attack. He was dead set on telling people why he thought Cal Cunningham was wrong for the job. I think it took Cunningham a little bit longer. His opening comment was more along the lines of, you know, I'm going to be listening, I'm going to be positive. But then once he took a few jabs from Tillis, then he was able to be part of that discussion too, give back as well as he got. And I think we got a better sense of how the two would be in a debate when they're working on Capitol Hill. I mean, it's important beyond this election to have someone who's in the Senate who's going to be able to deal with people of different persuasions and different takes on various issues and be able to give just as good as they get. I think we got a better sense of that from this type of debate than we would if it had just been, you've got 30 seconds, you're done, then the next person, and no rebuttal. They were able to get a back and forth that I think was kind of helpful.
What about you, April?
Well, I think the downside was there were so many issues we didn't get a chance to hear from the candidates on. So we didn't hear them talk about education, really. We didn't get a chance to hear them do a really deep dive into the economy. We didn't get a chance to hear them talk about immigration. And so there was so much time spent on the very important issue of the pandemic, but there are other issues that voters need to know about as they decide, you know, who to cast their ballot for. As far as the difference in style, I thought it was an interesting contrast. Tillis, who is behind in the polls, I think really felt as though he had no choice but to come out swinging, and we saw that with his opening statement. He kind of started very early on linking Cal Cunningham with Pelosi, with Schumer. We saw Tillis do that in the debates with the late Kay Hagan as well, tying her to Obama. So that wasn't new in terms of his approach. But I did think that the voters had an opportunity to see Cal Cunningham's temperament. And, you know, he's ahead in the polls. So this is an opportunity for him to kind of tell his story. And I thought he was very effective at doing that.
Well, one of the other issues that they did finally get to is the idea of systemic racism is certainly a very hot topic in our country right now. They were talked about systemic racism. They were asked for their own definition of it. Does it exist? And is there a solution? They had very, very different answers. Let's take a listen to that.
Just 4 weeks ago, about 3 miles from here, we had protesters chanting, "Abolish the police." While they were protesting, I wrote this down because I didn't want to get it wrong. Cal Cunningham tweeted, "I join you in the fight." And now this has gotten out of control. You saw the reports of the 2 shootings in Los Angeles over the weekend. 2 people ambushed by somebody. These protesters now go to the hospital and say, "I hope you die." We just had a law enforcement officer in the western part of the state die, shot in the face, died, a Marine who had been serving in the police department for 9 years, die. The answer to the question is to get people in the room. It would have been to pass the PROTECT Act and allow Democrats to amend it any way they wanted to, and they shut it down. And Cal was okay with that vote. I'm not okay with that vote. There are issues, there are bad actors.
Systemic racism shows up in very quiet places, and that's because of the history that we all inherit. Getting from here to the future that we need is going to require thoughtful and intentional, serious investment and effort on the part of the government. It's not just about law enforcement, and I wanted to address this because I'm going to take a back seat to no one when it comes to making sure that our communities are safe, and the proposals that I've put out invest in stronger law enforcement. And what happened on the Senate floor with that PROTECT Act, that was a railroad job. That was written in a closed room. It was not, didn't go through a hearing process. There was not discussions about how it would be amended. That's not how you bring people together around one of the most important issues of our time. But systemic racism.
So, April, they both acknowledge that systemic racism exists, but the approach to fix it or to walk our way through the next side of this quite different. Defund the police, a phrase we hear a lot lately, has a whole lot of different definitions to different people, but it is something that Tom Tillis brought up. Did he sell it on what he believes would be effective when it comes to, you know, how we approach systemic racism and defunding or police? He says, no, we don't at all. Whereas we have Cunningham, who is more like, well, we take some of those resources and we put them in the community.
Well, you know, what was so interesting about Tom Tillis's response is it really wasn't a response to systemic racism. You know, he mentioned forced sterilization, and then he pivoted to, you know, the tragic shooting of police officers. And that was it. I mean, he did talk about the PROTECT Act, but he didn't really acknowledge where we see racism. And I thought Cal Cunningham did a very good job of showing his deep understanding of the problem. So again, not just about law enforcement, as he noted, but he talked about healthcare, which ties into the pandemic that we're currently in. He talked about housing. He talked about the wealth gap. He talked about education and how racism rears its ugly head in all of those. The other thing that I thought he did really well was he also used it as an opportunity to focus on the opioid crisis, which you know, impacts not only people of color, but also white communities as well. He was able to use that to then talk about expansion of Medicaid. He was also able to get in the fact that he's a former prosecutor. So I thought he was able to really effectively use that question and to paint a picture about his understanding and also about who he is as a candidate. And I just didn't feel as though Tillis did more than just try to appeal to his base without appealing to a broader population.
And Mitch, that's my next question for you. It did feel a little bit like Tillis stayed fairly close to the president and, you know, his perception of law as a law and order president, as he likes to phrase himself. Is there a benefit to that?
Well, I think what he was trying to do with that answer, at least the tail end of the answer, was to align Cal Cunningham with rioters and looters by saying, you know, I join you in the fight, and trying to say that Cal Cunningham was supporting, or at least was not actively against the people who have caused street violence. I thought Cunningham addressed that pretty well. He said, no, you know, I support the police. I support more funding for the police so they could do the types of things that would make them police better. The first part of Tillis's answer, which got back into some legislative history, I don't know is going to get a lot of play, but he basically said, look, we had in North Carolina this decades-long program of forced sterilization. I was the Speaker of the House when we finally took action to help give restitution for people who suffer from this, and he gave a little dig at Cal Cunningham, who had been in the state Senate during the time when legislators did nothing about it. I don't know that that's going to play very well, but he obviously was trying to put forward the message that, look, if I see cases of racism, I'm going to respond, whereas Cal Cunningham is supporting the rioters and looters. But as I said before, I think Cunningham's response, for many of the reasons that have already been discussed, was good. He said, you know, I do support the police, and I think racism shows up in these other areas that are his priority areas.
So when they started talking about raising taxes, you can't get through one full debate without bringing the Bible, I think, in at least one time by one candidate. And that certainly happened tonight. Let's take a listen to that.
But while we're on the subject of mistakes, Cal, when you were about 22 years old, you said that communism had certain merits, right? When you became the student body president, I don't think you should be held against that. That's something that 22-year-olds must say. When you were running for student body president, you told the students of Chapel Hill you weren't going to raise tuition. Then you go on a junket with a board member and you come back to raise tuition. Was that a mistake? I'll call it a mistake again, something a young 22, 23-year-old makes. Then you run for Senate. You're 29 years old. You're a graduate of a law school. You've completed studies at London School of Economics. You went to Vanderbilt. You're well educated, well articulated, looked into the camera and say, I pledge not to raise your taxes. And then a few months later, he broke that pledge. Cal has said anything he could to get elected. And
A moment from scripture here. He'd be able to see the speck of dust in my eye better if he got the plank out of his own seriously. This is a person who time and time again shifts his positions, writes and rewrites his record in order to meet what the special interests need, what his party interests need.
Can you give me an example of that?
Of course. Well, look, he stood on a stage very much like this 6 years ago and said that he was going to fix the broken immigration system. He went to Washington, he made some proposals. The going got tough, and Senator Tillis got gone. The fact of the matter is, when the going got tough, in order to meet the moment of the political pressure, he switched.
Well, they were all over the place in this answer, weren't they? All right, so let's first talk about this setup by Senator Tillis of Cunningham. He really did set Cunningham up as a bit of an elitist, you know, when he went through the level of education that he's had, that he's a lawyer. And my question, Mitch, is that helpful when when Tillis is saying he's not the everyman, he's not you? How effective is that for those voters who haven't made that decision yet?
It could be. It's hard to say. I don't think that Cal Cunningham came across as elitist. So certainly by demeanor and by the way he answers, I don't think he's going to feed into that notion. It wasn't like Al Gore sighing on the debate stage and looking bad in comparison to the homie George W. Bush. But I do think that the interesting part to me about the answer that we just played for Tillis was this was his response to that recent scandal about calling the office, and the staffer tells the person, look, you're on your own.
And that was his reference to the 22-year-old staffer.
Right, so he said the staffer, and he says, when you were 22-year-old, you supported communism, but I know that, you know, that's just the kind of mistake 22-year-olds do. So this was really part of a pivot, but then he used it to build on this idea that Cal Cunningham, as was his constant theme, will say one thing to get elected and then do another. He tied that into his run for student body president, and then for his service in one term in the state Senate about 20 years ago. So I thought that was interesting. I don't know that it's going to end up being particularly effective for Tom Tillis, but it did get people away from that scandal involving the worker in his office.
Yeah, we've seen that ad over and over and over again. April, as far as that is concerned, one of the things that Tillis also did was he referenced the fact he didn't get his four-year degree until he was in his 30s. Mm-hmm. But it's interesting, too, that he has to go all the way back to when Cunningham was in college and 20 years ago when he was in the state Senate for a record.
Right.
How difficult do you think that is on his part to go on the attack when he's not got a lot to work with when it comes to political record?
Yeah, well, it's, you know, a totally different situation than the last time he was in a debate with the late Kay Hagan, right? Because she had been the senator for 6 years. He had a record, and his attacks, if you remember those debates, he was able to tie exactly what she had done while she was a senator, what she had done when she was a state officer, and he doesn't have that opportunity. I thought what was really interesting about him talking about Cal Cunningham when he was 22, it felt a little disingenuous, him saying, you know, you said that communism may have merit, and we shouldn't hold that against you. But really the reason why he mentioned that was because he wanted people to know that even at 22, these were statements that he had made. So it felt a little disingenuous. It may have been that he was trying to paint Cunningham as an elitist. It didn't come across when he was talking about all the things that he had done. It almost sounded like he was lifting him up. I know he wasn't, but that's the way it kind of read. And for those people who haven't yet made up their mind, who are trying to decide, I'm not sure that's going to have the impact that he was hoping it would have.
For both of you, did either of them do enough to sway the voter who hasn't made a decision yet, Mitch?
Well, I think in a debate, the first job is don't make a major gaffe that's going to kill you. And I don't think either one of them did that. The second thing is make sure you fortify your base. I don't know that either one of them did anything that hurt them on that front. And then the last piece is try to sway voters who can be persuaded. I think for Tillis, it's more important to fortify the base and then try to sway the voters. I think for Cunningham, the base is going to be voting for him because they're anti-Trump. They're going to be out there to vote for a Democrat. So he really can spend more time trying to sway people in the middle. And I think his answers fit with that game plan.
April, you know, the popularity in North Carolina with President Trump is consistently higher than with Senator Tillis. There's that gap right there. Was, in your opinion, Tillis effective enough to grab those particular voters who might go the other way, who are going to vote for President Trump still?
Yeah, I don't think so. And I think it's because Tillis has a problem with his base. And so not only is he trying to shore up his base, but at the same time, the strategies that would do that would also alienate those independent voters. So he's in a really tough situation. And I don't think that his approach and his strategy moved that ball forward in terms of those independent voters. I thought Cal Cunningham is in a much stronger position. He's ahead in the polls. He doesn't have as much of a record to run on. And I think he came across as very likable. And so I think he probably did make up a lot of ground when it comes to those undecided voters.
And people are already voting.
Yeah.
They're already voting in this state, the first state in the country to begin the election in the United States. Well, my last question for you is, you know, we have the next debate here at CBS 17 next week, Tuesday. If I'm Cunningham and Tillis, what do I need to work on? What do I really need to focus on to just blow it out next week?
Well, I think with Tillis, I think he's in a really tough situation. I think he will have to, maybe if he's not as much on the defensive, I think he needs to demonstrate that he can legislate for not just the Republicans, but also those independents. And with Cunningham, I think he needs to basically do more of the same. I thought he had a really successful debate.
Mitch?
For Cunningham, I think he was at his strongest when he was just answering questions and not trying to throw in the anecdote, which to me sometimes seemed forced. He kind of stumbled over at least one of them. So when he was just answering questions, when he was answering the attacks from Tillis, I thought he did really well. He didn't come across poorly. He came across as if he knew what he was saying, knew what he was doing. So I think he's strong on that front. Maybe try to avoid the forced anecdotes. For Tillis, I think he really has to plug more into negatives for Cunningham. I mean, he tried to tie him to Pelosi and Schumer every once in a while.
They do that every time. It's always McConnell,
right?
The current
and
president.
At one point, he referred to Biden as the running mate. And I thought, well, wait a minute. He's just Cal Cunningham's been promoted to the presidential ticket. But I think he has to look at the record. And as you mentioned, not a whole lot of legislative record because it's been almost 20 years. But his record in recent years in private business. We saw occasional references to his work with that Waste Zero, and they got the PPE money. He didn't want it, but they took it. So I think he needs to get more into that to make people question Cal Cunningham more.
Was there anything they didn't talk about tonight that you wish that they had, April?
Well, definitely education. You know, that's a big issue here in North Carolina, particularly where you have a greater acknowledgement of the need for strong education where children aren't able to go back to school. They touched up on that just a little bit. And of course, immigration. Immigration is a big issue here in North Carolina. And so it would be good to hear them talk about their policies as far as that's concerned as well.
Mitch?
I think those would be ones that ought to be discussed. Also, the economy. We really didn't hear a whole lot about what are we going to do to make sure that we can get the economy back on the plane that it needs to be going so that we aren't dealing with all of these issues with a growing deficit and problems that are well beyond what we're already seeing with COVID-19.
And it didn't even, the big news this week was where the federal deficit hit. The trillions of dollars that we now sit. That never even was part of the conversation. There was an opportunity missed there, I think, for either candidate, really.
Yeah, they certainly could have talked about that. I think because there was such a focus on COVID-19, to talk about balancing the budget or getting the federal fiscal house in order seems to many people to be is kind of the wrong time to do it when you're talking about putting aid out there. But yeah, that's certainly something that the next senator is going to have to address at some point.
They got to pay for it. And they need to talk about whether they'll raise taxes, where this money will come from. Do you agree?
Oh, absolutely. And I think with the next debate, hopefully with some time limits, we'll have an opportunity to hear them talk about some of these additional issues that are vitally important to the people of North Carolina.
Well, that second debate coming up next week, and I'm so happy that you guys are going to be back with us to just break it all down once again. I think it might be quite fun. You guys are awesome. April Dawson and Mitch Kokai, thank you so much for being a part of this. And again, I'll see you next week. We got our homework to do, don't we?
Yes, we do.
Guys.
All right, good job there, Russ. Looking ahead, the two candidates will face off again, as Russ mentioned, on CBS 17 Tuesday, September 22nd.
And we are bringing you the debate and post-debate live across the state. Join us right here at 7 o'clock next week.
And our analysis will break down the debate. You'll get live reaction from undecided voters. You can always join in on that conversation with us on social media. Use the hashtag NC Senate Debate. Thanks for joining us tonight.